Grazie, collega. Allora cerco di condividere il mio schermo per fare la presentazione PowerPoint, quindi un attimo per favore. Funziona così?
Sì,
Allora,
sì, funziona.
va bene. Allora,
Sì.
ok,
Grazie.
ok, funziona. Allora, innanzitutto vorrei ringraziare gli organizzatori dell'invito. Grazie mille a Mauro Mantovani, a Simona Langhella, a Rafael Ramis Barceló e a Igor Agostini. Mi fa molto piacere stare con voi. Io ho letto tantissimi articoli di tutti i partecipanti a questo colloquio, quindi mi sento molto onorato di stare fra di voi. Allora, per il resto della mia presentazione parlerò in inglese, ma dopo la mia presentazione ovviamente è possibile anche fare le domande in italiano. But so I think for reasons of precision, it's better that I give this presentation in English. So I've been asked to talk about early modern scholasticism from a legal historical perspective, since I teach legal history. My background is in classical philology and in law. And so that's a little bit where I come from. I'm not a philosopher by training, but of course, I've always enjoyed very much the dialogue with philosophers. So I've already said a little word of gratitude. I would also like to say a word of, let's say, apologies, because it's a rather busy period at my faculty at the moment. So yesterday and also tomorrow, I had deliberations and students who have the right to consult their exam copies. And since I have 1,500 students in the second semester, that takes quite a lot of time. So those afficia that come with the professorship prevent me from being as present as I would like to be. So I hope somehow there will be also a follow-up conference, perhaps in another place, maybe in Rome, where we can really meet. But so apologies for the fact that I'm not able to attend all of the papers. It's really not because I'm not interested. It's merely because of these practical businesses. And then lastly, a small word of warning before I start my talk. Well, so my talk is a bit more legal historical, a little bit more practical and moralistic, perhaps, in its approach. It will not be about metaphysics. And in this regard, I think it's important to remember that there are a couple of distinctions that are being made, I think, since the 19th century, but which prevent us, I think, from seeing and studying early modern scholasticism, also late medieval scholasticism, from a more comprehensive perspective. And I think one of those distinctions that has been artificially made, I think, regards precisely distinction between, let's say, pure philosophy, people who are interested in metaphysics on the one hand, and then, let's say, practical philosophy, or people who are more interested in moral subjects on the other hand. One can see that I think, for example, already in the 1920s, 1930s, when, for example, the sanctification of Robert Bellarmine is being prepared, like you can see that the people who want to make him a saint try to really diminish and even hide the fact that, for example, he has been teaching on contract law and on the morality of the market while he was in Leuven. Between 1569 and 1576. And this is not an isolated phenomenon. And I think it prevents us from paying sufficient attention sometimes also to these very pragmatic aspects of late medieval and early modern scholastic theologians. So that's a word of warning, because I think it's really very much present in our minds today, this distinction, but this distinction, I think, prevents us from really going back to the sources and seeing them in an all-comprehensive way. So let's start. And I think when we talk about law, the same kind of conceptual clarification that we need when we talk about scholasticism is also necessary when we talk about law, because, of course, law today is not necessarily the same as law in the age of the scholastics. And of course, this might seem very basic, what I'm saying here, but I think it's important to recall the fact that law should not be associated with the law that we associate with legal positivism from the 19th century and parliaments who enact laws, who are the factories of law. That is not, I think, principally what the scholastics are talking about when they discuss law. They think about use, and use in its manifold ways, of course. Use, which is, of course, for them, use also in the sense of Roman law of Digest 111, simply the art of the good and the equitable. So that is not necessarily to do anything with legislative activity. It can, but it's not necessarily exactly the same. So I think when we study late medieval and early modern scholastics, it's important to keep in mind that they have in their background the use in the sense of the jus commune, so jus civile in the sense of Roman law, and then also the canon law. They, of course, also pay attention to the natural law, which is the supreme norm. They pay attention to divine law, divine positive law, of course, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the customary law, and regulatory acts, legislative activities, which is now almost the only sense left of law, is only one source of use for the scholastics. I will come back on this because it seems basic, but it isn't, I think. It isn't, first of all, already because, of course, Roman law and canon law are extremely vast. The scholastic tradition, I think, is essentially a tradition that, well, puts a lot of emphasis on the analysis of texts and textual traditions. And of course, we cannot limit ourselves to just studying, let's say, the purely theological texts of Thomas Aquinas, of Gregory of Rimini, of Duns Scotus. There is also always this Roman law tradition and this canon law tradition. Roman law tradition, which for them is, of course, especially a tradition of the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian of the 6th century, which was revived as the starting point for legal studies at the universities, Bologna and so on, from the end of the 11th century onwards. And of course, canon law, but canon law, which in itself very much draws on Roman law. When we talk about the legal textual tradition, as has been said before, apparently so in the talk by Jacob Schmutz, I think it's important indeed to realize that this scholastic tradition is a cumulative tradition. So Roman law and canon law are not studied alone, but of course the commentaries also on Roman law and canon law texts. That means the glossators, the commentators, Azzo, or for example, Bartolus, and then also the commentators on the Corpus Juris Canonici, so the decretists, and the decretalists, for example, Hugutio, or then also Abbas Panormitanus. So there's lots and lots of legal sources that all these scholastic theologians were immensely familiar with. It's actually, from a purely legal historical perspective, extremely interesting to see how well acquainted these theologians were with not only Roman law, canon law in themselves, but also then the whole commentary tradition on these fundamental sources. And then that means also with, of course, the vocabulary and the grammar that comes with Roman law and canon law. As has also been said apparently then by Jacob Schmutz, this is very clear, I think, in the way that law is being discussed by early modern scholastics. They, of course, also take into account humanistic currents. There is no opposition, at least as far as I can see, between humanism and scholasticism in 16th century, 17th century authors. It's a mix of both. If you look at canon lawyers like Diego de Covarrubias Leiva, he will very often, of course, try to show off with his humanist erudition or say that he has found a more original manuscript of a certain Roman law or canon law text. So scholasticism, humanism, in my view, this opposition is also very much exaggerated when it comes to the 16th century, and is, I think, also again a legacy more of the 19th century than of the early modern period itself. As you can see in Covarrubias Leiva, Martinez, Luqueta, Antonio Gomez. Of course, I'm not going to go into all this, but I think it's just important to draw attention to this profound familiarity of these early modern scholastics with the legal tradition, with legal tradition understood in this pre-modern sense of the word. And so I allow myself also to just refer to some of the basic secondary literature on the subject, especially Manlio Bellomo's work, of course, on the common legal past of Europe, which I think is very important background reading if one wants to understand how these scholastic theologians in the early modern period tried to reason and develop their arguments. You can see that until the end, until basically the beginning of the 20th century, this familiarity with Roman law and with canon law in the scholastic tradition. Here, just an example from an early, late, 17th century work, Jus et Justitia Juridico-Theologicae Tractata, by a relatively unknown scholastic theologian, Augustinus Michel, who was teaching in Untersdorf in Bavaria. But it's just to give you an example of this profound familiarity of scholastic theologians with the legal tradition, as you can see in the very long title also of this work. Jus et Justitia Juridico-Theologico Tractata, in qua praeter materias a theologis speculativis de justitia tractari solitas succincta, nova clara ac solida metodo per tractantur omnes materia juris civilis, quatuor institutionum imperialium libris comprehensae. So that's also something we can see. The institutes of Justinian will become more and more already, like in the late 16th century. We can see this with Valère Regnault, for example, in France, in his manual for confessors. The institutes of Justinian will become a very important basis for structuring also theological discussions of moral theology and legal problems. But so in general, I think in these sources, you can find the idea that, well, a good theologian needs to have basic knowledge of civil law, that is of Roman law, because that's the basis of good knowledge of canon law, and a good knowledge of canon law is necessary for anyone who wants to become a confessor or a professor of moral theology, which is of course to do also with this profound jurisdictional, juridical understanding of conscience, of the forum internum, the forum conscientiae, which is there, I think, from at least the 12th century until the beginning of the 20th century. Well, many things could be said about this, but I move on to just briefly illustrate this profound knowledge displayed by scholastic theologians in the early modern period. Well, first of all, one can ask, of course, why this was necessary, this profound engagement with law from the side of theology studies. And let's say from a theoretical point of view, this is, of course, discussed in many treatises that deal with the first part of the Summa Theologiae. So, but you can also find it, of course, in the exposition of Francis Suarez on the laws and on God the lawmaker. So in the Proemium there, and the introduction there, he explains why it is important and absolutely necessary for a theologian to understand law. So he says the road to salvation passes through three actions and moral rectitude. And since moral rectitude strongly depends on law being, as it were, the rule of human actions, the study of law is a major part of theology. In treating of laws, the sacred doctrine of theology investigates nothing less than God himself and his function as a legislator. It is a task of the theologians to care for the consciences of the pilgrims on earth, yet the rectitude of consciences is dependent on observing the law, just like moral pravity is dependent on breaking the law, since the law is every rule which leads to the gain of eternal salvation if observed, as it must be, and which leads to the loss of eternal salvation when it is broken. The study of law then pertains to theologians to the extent that law binds conscience. Here too, of course, many things could be said. I just wanted to give one illustration of a more theoretical reflection by a major Jesuit like Francisco Suarez on the necessity to study and have a profound knowledge of use. Of course, it has to do also with the more practical role that scholastics played already in the Middle Ages. I mean, this is also something that is often a little bit ignored, but if you already look at someone like Albertus Magnus, for example, he was very much involved in dispute resolution on a daily basis. I had the pleasure of assisting just a couple of months ago on a lecture given by Sebastian Militao in Strasbourg on the role that Albertus Magnus had played in Strasbourg in a lot of disputes, for example, about the construction of the cathedral. So this scholastic theologian, whom we mostly associate with high-minded theories on metaphysics and so on, was in his daily life himself very much involved in dispute resolution, and therefore also acquainted with use, with Roman law, with canon law. Of course, the clergymen played a role as notaries for a very long time until the end of the Ancien Regime. We know that many of these scholastic theologians were confessors, not only to of course, the kings, which is very much studied in the secondary literature. I, for example, point out here the work by Nicole Reinhardt, but also to merchants, to businessmen, to all kinds of professionals, to make sure that they could give them advice so that they could save their soul while exercising their trade. Of course, what even reinforced the juridical character of the notion of conscience was the idea launched on the Council of Trent that also absolving someone of his sins is a truly judicial act. So the confessor was really put on a par with a judex, and so he also needed the qualities of a true judge and also the knowledge of a true judge. Here again, many examples could be given. Of course, as you know, Thomas de Mercado is very famous as a confessor, also as an advisor to merchants, and therefore wrote a lot about commercial contracts, financial transactions in his Tratos y Contratos de Mercaderes. In another place in the Low Countries, we had this example of Leonardus Lessius, who was the main advisor of the businessman in the Antwerp Stock Exchange. And for example, in the Latin American context in Lima, for example, and we had Pedro de Oñate, who wrote an extremely vast treatise on contracts, because he said, well, contract law is basically the normative architecture that we need to be able to, well, determine what exactly the rights and obligations of individuals are on the market, and so to decide, for example, and to be able to decide whether restitution is necessary or not. So just 3 random examples, but which show this profound, extremely profound knowledge of legal subjects by a scholastic.
2 minutes maximum.
Yeah, I'm almost finished, don't worry. So because law is understood in the sense of use, what we basically see also is that these theologians take on the role of, well, people who assess in a critical way legislative acts. We can see this, for example, in the whole discussion on poverty relief in Spain in the 16th century, where Domingo de Soto critically assesses a legislative initiatives to basically diminish the rise of the poor on the basis of his knowledge of jus naturae and the jus commune. We can see it also, for example, in critical engagement with legislative activities to solve monetary issues in Spain, in the work of someone like Juan de Mariana, who also uses his knowledge of jus naturae, of jus commune, to basically criticize quantitative easing policies in the late 16th and early 17th century in Spain. So a huge symbiosis of legal and theological reasoning, which also explains a huge impact, I think, both on theological issues and also in the legal tradition of the legal knowledge of the early modern scholastic theologians. Of course, in the field of probabilism, we can discuss that in the discussion also, but also in profoundly theological subjects, such as the whole discussion on grace and free will. If you look at Suarez, for example, the lectures which he gave in Coimbra, and then the publication in 1600 of his small theological discussions, nevertheless 600 pages, it's full of references to jus commune contract law to try and understand the God-man relationship, because they will say, well, just like offer and acceptance are necessary to create binding contract, well, in the same way, man has to accept the grace offered by God in order to really make this process of justification effective. We can see the impact of theology on the legal tradition, of course, in the early modern period itself. Here, just a work on the left by a Calvinist judge in the late 17th century, who was drawing on 16th century scholastic theologians to try and solve problems that he as a judge was confronted with in the external court. Another example I give here on the slide is the treatise on obligations, extremely influential by Robert-Joseph Potier, which was a director of the Code Napoleon. So these are jurists in which we can really see the profound impact of early modern scholasticism. Conversely, or let's say in the same way, so Gordley, myself, and also Paulo Astori have been able to show how these theological discussions on contracts left their imprint on contract law in the European legal tradition. So much more could be said about this, of course. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.